After the attacks in Paris, can governments strike a balance between security and personal privacy? Britain's Prime Minister wants to ban messaging apps that can be used by what he calls suspected terrorists. A justified response or an unnecessary overreaction? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. There's been a striking visual image of increased security after the attack on satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in Paris. In France, it was seeing 10,000 troops on the streets, said to be for civilian protection. Then there are the less visible measures being discussed behind the scenes. In the case of the British Prime Minister, that means gaining access to online chatter. Responding to the Paris attacks, David Cameron said there should be no means of communication which the government cannot read. Cameron wants new laws that would allow security services to read encrypted communications sent by members of the public on apps such as Apple's iMessage or Facebook's WhatsApp. The sort of digital communication he says could be used by suspected terrorists.
The attacks in Paris once again demonstrated the scale of the terrorist threat that we face and the need to have robust powers through our intelligence and security agencies and policing in order to keep our people safe. The next government will have to legislate again in 2016. And what I can say is if I'm Prime Minister, I will make sure it is a comprehensive piece of legislation that makes sure we do not allow terrorists safe space to communicate with each other.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. With me here in the studio, Nino Kader, technology specialist and social media commentator. Then from London, we're joined by Sarah Ogilvie, a policy officer at the human rights group Liberty. And completing our panel, Justin Crump, a risk analyst and security and intelligence specialist. Welcome to you all. Justin, we'll start with you first. What do you make of David Cameron's comments? How would banning free chat services like WhatsApp and iMessage help in the fight against extremists?
I think, looking at his wider point, which is that we can't allow the safe space for communication. And I think that is a very important thing here. I mean, if any sort of criminal, and we talk about terrorism and extremism, knows that they have a safe area to communicate, to organise, that makes their activities significantly easier. It makes it harder for law enforcement and security services to detect and intercept them. And again, this is not something he'd raise without a real point to doing so. It's obviously something that's going to cause controversy, especially in an open civil society. And so this is something that is obviously very important, and it's obviously an area of great concern. And to name those particular apps shows that the nature in which they work makes it very hard to understand the networks of extremists and understand the way in which they're communicating.
But if we go on like this, we're going to end up living in a police state, aren't we? Under constant surveillance, where no one is entitled to absolute privacy. Is the threat from random acts of terror worth the infringement upon our civil liberties?
Well, and this is the great debate at the heart of our civilization, and at what price freedom? And you can turn that back around as well and say, freedom at what price? And I think this is the great importance around all this, and the fact that we're having this debate is fantastic, because we're in a society that has this. We agonise over the need to intercept these communications, the need to stop these acts. We are a society that's chosen to live free of fear, and that's very important. But then you run into the role of the state, which is to protect its citizens. And we have a great system of checks and balances in the UK. And I think that is fantastic. There is civil oversight of the powers that are in place. There are independent former judges who analyse everything the intelligence services try and do with data and why they use it. And this is not something that people can pick and choose and dig into, and the state can go into and look at. In fact, there's a problem, if anything, with the amount of data that's there and making use of it effectively, let alone in a legal fashion, that is being looked over in the way in which we have this fantastic structure to do so. Yeah. And people certainly aren't sitting there looking at this and making something of it all just because they can. This is something that's very, very targeted, has to be very, very justified to be used, but it does save lives.
All right, let's bring in Sarah Ogilvie. Sarah, what do you make of David Cameron's proposals, and what do you make of what you've just heard from Justin Crump?
I've got a few points to say, really. In response to David Cameron's call for more powers, it's really important that after terrorist atrocities that we look at what went wrong and we try to work out how we can prevent things like that from happening again. But it's kind of an easy and superficial response sometimes to call for more powers and legislation. Actually, the harder thing to do is to look at the evidence and look at the facts and work out what went wrong and work out why we're not using the powers that we do have better. The United Kingdom has huge amounts of surveillance powers, as Justin has just outlined, and the Paris attacks, from what we know of them, were perpetrated by people who were already known to the security services. So the powers that we already have in place could and should have been used. Similarly, if you look at the Lee Rigby murder in the UK a couple of years ago, the perpetrators of that murder were also known to the security services, and a report recently identified a number of failings as to why in a number of different processes which led to the death of Lee Rigby. So it's much harder to actually look at the processes and improve the powers, improve how we use the powers we've got, but that's the really effective way of keeping us safe. In terms of what David Cameron has called for, you know, it feels kind of naive, and it's understandable why he wants to be shown to be tough on things, but I would prefer my Prime Minister to come up with really effective solutions to terrorism, and I don't think this is it. I would also challenge slightly the way Justin has set out how our surveillance system works at the moment. I don't think there are enough safeguards in place to guarantee our privacy and to guarantee our safety at the same time. What at Liberty we think that we completely agree with surveillance against people who are suspected of crimes or terrorism, but we think that surveillance needs to be intelligence-led. It needs to be targeted against people who we suspect, rather than this general sort of surveillance of people that we learned about through the Snowden revelations. We think that surveillance should only be possible with a judicial warrant. So people, the security services or the police, should have to go to a judge beforehand and say that they want to place someone under surveillance. At the moment, the Home Secretary can make that decision for herself, and even more worrying, if police or other law enforcement agencies want to access our communications data rather than intercept the actual substance of our communications, then they can decide that internally. The safeguards really aren't strong enough, and it seems incredibly worrying that David Cameron wants to take us even further down that path.
All right, Justin, do you want to respond to that? I mean, it's quality intelligence and interpretation of that will prevent further attacks. It's not the sheer weight of information that the authorities gather. Yeah, exactly. Well, and there's a massive difference between data, information, and intelligence. I think the trick is, and this was shown quite clearly in Paris in a way, actually, there's a lot of what we do that's called link analysis. So you're looking at links between particular people. Now, of course, you can find a suspect individual or something that's connected through any sort of means of intelligence work. And again, all this comes as part of a holistic whole, and indeed a holistic, and comprehensive approach to tackling this issue. But the link analysis you can kind of do, you've picked someone up, you're looking for the rest of their network. And we saw this in Paris to an extent when you had a secondary incident that occurred, obviously ended in the siege in the kosher supermarket, by an individual who was linked to the main two. It's not clear exactly how strong operationally linkages were or anything else, but certainly his partner and the partner was one of the other two attackers. It spoken sort of some 500 times. And there were stronger connections there. And I think sometimes when you start to unravel a network, and a covert network especially, it's very important to be able to see actually what calls have been made, when, where, and to whom, to build out the whole picture of the network itself. And that's often what gives you the connections to other groups, and certainly other cells and other organizations and individuals who might be interested or might be carrying out actions. And I think without the ability to unravel those connections, you're targeting one thing at a time. And it is an important thing. But I would also completely agree, this is not any sort of panacea to tackling this problem whatsoever. This is a tiny piece of a massive intelligence puzzle, but it is an important one. OK, let's bring in Nino Keda then, here in the studio, who's been listening with interest to all of that. What do you make of David Cameron's proposals?
Well, I agree with Sarah that it's kind of naive to just say that with one silver bullet by banning encryption that they could, have more insight into extremists' calendars, for example, as if they put something on the calendar. We'll see what happens, but I'm not sure that technology was at fault in these attacks. Okay,
I mean, millions of people use messaging services like WhatsApp and Apple's iMessage, which is built into its iPhones and its iPads. Correct. How does that sort of encryption work, and why are intelligence agencies and our government so worried about it?
Well, it works by taking plain text, adding a cipher to it, and then decrypting it on the other end. So along the route, anyone that can see the message as it's going won't be able to decipher what's the content of the message.
It's maths, basically, is
yes.
what you say.
Exactly.
Okay. And it's not the first time that governments and intelligence agencies have called for a ban on encryption. I mean, as far as I understand, this goes back as far as the 1970s. And the technology industry is getting tougher and tougher in its response. How do you think it's likely to respond to what David Cameron is calling for?
Well, they might pick up and move because the world is a small place now, and companies that, let's say, are not allowed to do encryption in the UK might pick up and move their operations because customers are demanding it. They're demanding for banking transactions and whatnot. They need to have the communication encrypted to prevent hackers.
Of course, you can't ban encryption entirely because our financial industries depend upon it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so is it technically possible to give governments and security agencies a backdoor, if you like, a golden key into the encryption that protects services such as WhatsApp and iMessage?
Yeah, it's possible, but it's also possible for hackers to get in there too.
Okay, that would be the #1 target, I suppose, of cyber criminals.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly.
How would you do that?
And we've seen that no matter what kind of defenses people put up against hackers, they somehow still seem to get in. Most recently with Sony.
Okay, well, critics are describing David Cameron's response to the Paris attacks as a knee-jerk reaction. And this isn't the first time that there's been a push for tougher security laws after such an attack. Just a month after the September 11th attacks in 2001, the United States passed the Patriot Act, empowering the government to spy on people's phone calls without giving any evidence of suspected wrongdoing. And then there was a strong reaction in Britain after the London bombings in July 2005. New laws allowed the government to take away a person's citizenship and doubled the amount of time that a suspect could be held without charge. And France also passed a new law in response to the so-called 7/7 attacks. It lengthened the maximum prison sentence for those convicted of terrorism charges and allowed for video monitoring in public places. Sarah Ogilvie, why do you think our politicians hurriedly introduce or amend security legislation in the wake of high-profile attacks like the one we saw in Paris last week? Are the measures genuinely needed to make us safer? They're just topping up existing legislation. Is it to make our politicians appear as though they're doing something to keep us safe, that they're tough on terrorism, bearing in mind that there's an election in the UK in May? Or is there something more sinister, do you think, behind all of this?
Well, as you say, we're in the lead up to a general election in the United Kingdom, and it's hard to know how that influences how politicians operate. It's worth saying that while the Prime Minister and some other politicians have called for more powers, Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband have both resisted that temptation at the moment.
The leaders of the opposition in the UK, yeah.
The leaders of the other big parties in the UK at the moment. Now, whether that is a cynical move, whether they think that this kind of gesture politics is a real way to make people feel safe, or whether they even understand what it is that they're calling for. You know, David Cameron calling for the end to encryption sounds really naive or misguided. Whichever one of those reasons is, I think they've actually got it a bit wrong. Because if you look at the protest in Paris on Sunday, there were millions of people who went out on the street to defend their freedom of expression, to stand up for their human rights. And we know that privacy is the other side of the coin to freedom of expression. You know, freedom of expression lets you say what you want to say out in public. Privacy lets you say that in private. It lets you develop those ideas. It lets you think what you want. It lets you love who you want. You can't have one without the other. So I think that actually what people want to see is their politicians acting responsibly, responding to the evidence, and taking kind of a calm look at this and work out how to keep us safe. I think they're wrong if they think that this kind of calling for new powers and loudspeaker politics is going to make people feel safer, or to think that's what people really want. Justin
Crump, we're no less safe today than we were before the Paris attacks a week ago. We've known for some time that we all risk being caught up in a random act of terror. And indeed, in Paris, early investigations suggest that the Paris attackers were already known to the security service. Indeed, they were under surveillance, and it was an intelligence failure that led to them remaining free to carry out the attacks, and not a lack of information. Again, I come back to this point that it's quality intelligence that matters here, not information.
Yes, although intelligence is derived from the collection of information and data and putting that together. And you know, I don't think you could argue that all the information was available, otherwise the intelligence assessment that was made would have been correct. I mean, I think if you had individuals that were under suspicion and under surveillance, and you knew that they had obtained illegal firearms and obtained illegal ammunition and expressed an intent to do something, you would definitely move against them. So clearly information was not available. And that is the nature of intelligence. You see a small piece of the jigsaw and you are doing your very best to make the best assessment you can to carry out an action and to inform a decision maker who is going to conduct the action. So again, pieces were missing from that puzzle, and I think, you know, while I agree with the naivety of the way that the Prime Minister's statements are being portrayed, and you know, certain things there don't match, but there is something here about the world of data that is opening up, the multiple means that are being made available to extremists of all natures to communicate. And indeed, Ayman al-Zawahiri himself from Al-Qaeda has said, you know, this shows that this is our time, because the internet is, you know, shows us that God wants us to act now. And it's that sort of, you know, that is the advantage it seems giving in terms of communication and sharing knowledge for these groups. And I think, you know, so the Prime Minister's statement really reflects the desire of the intelligence services to be able to, you know, match the increase in communications technology, and that's hundreds of years old. I mean, that goes back to the telephone, goes back to email. Indeed, there's legislation around those that allows the services to see, you know, the data record. And again, this is macro data. This is who someone has connected with. It is not what they've said, you know, and the content of those messages. And again, it's that sort of thing that could have shown the third attacker in France much more early. And you know, that information probably was there as well. And it's undoubted, I think, in Paris there was an intelligence failure before the attack. The French did come back very strong with 2 immediate actions very quickly on the Friday, you know, and showed the capability there. And unfortunately, intelligence failures do happen. But the more information you've got, the better an assessment you can often make, as long as it is used, you know, with due care, and obviously with respect for what we stand for as a Western civilization.
You know, Kayla, if you had a backdoor key to WhatsApp and iMessage, I mean, imagine the amount of information that is generated. How on earth would a government go about finding the intelligence that it needs to head off an attack like the one we saw in Paris last week? You're looking for a needle in a haystack, aren't you?
Yeah, it's difficult, but there is some software that they've developed to do link analysis, as was said earlier, and also do keyword analysis, look for different types of trends. Where are people logging in from? What's near that location? There's a variety of different things that can be done. But in terms of the intelligence failure, it doesn't seem like it was a technology-based intelligence failure. So legislating more technology, I'm not sure, would be the solution. Because once you do make that change, the extremists will use a different technology. So you can't legislate that they use the ones that you have the back doors to.
Yeah, okay, you close the privacy hole, if you like, in apps like WhatsApp and iMessage. People who'd wish to do society harm, are resourceful, intelligent people, they'll just find another way.
Yeah, or they'll go back to old methods. They won't maybe use technology. Okay.
I mean, how long has encryption been around like this? You were an early adopter yourself.
Yeah, since around the 70s, PGP came out, which stands for pretty good privacy, by a man by the name of Zimmerman, and now he's on to making things like a pretty secure phone called the black phone, and things along those lines, but mainly for confidentiality reasons, for business, trade secrets, those types of things, where they are very protective of their privacy as well.
Okay. Sarah Ogilvie, it seems that this is just to pick up on what you were saying earlier. It seems that our politicians feel that what needs to be done to tackle the threat of terrorism is to intercept the perpetrators before they get the chance to strike by introducing legislation that infringes on everybody's public liberties. That's very short-sighted, isn't it? And does nothing to tackle the root cause or causes of extremism.
Yeah, I think you make a couple of interesting points there. There's tackling the root cause, and these sort of knee-jerk reactions don't go anywhere to try and coming up with a sensible way to combat terrorism. You know, we need to reflect the values that we preach to the world. You know, the United Kingdom talks about democracy, we talk about the rule of law, we talk about, you know, David Cameron spoke at the weekend about how we will absolutely defend our right to freedom of speech. And then we see these calls for more legislation. We see attempts to breach individuals' privacy on a mass scale, not just targeted at suspects, but breach the privacy of everyone. I think it's very difficult for us to try and combat terrorism when we're not really living up to the standards that we're setting for ourselves. Also, again, you know, we have to come back to what we learned through the Snowden revelations, that the state is spying on people across the country. It's not just the people that we suspect. And while I hear what Justin said about how he thinks that more information is more useful, actually what I want to see is the security services target their resources, target their money and their skills and energy at the people that we do suspect, you know, to go on intelligence-led surveillance. And when they have information about everybody, that surely ties up their time and waste their time in looking at people who cause absolutely no harm or who pose absolutely no threat to UK society. And I think that's a really worrying trend, not just from the perspective of our privacy, but from the perspective of our security as well. It seems like a regressive step.
Justin, is there a danger that the security services will be swamped, that there'll be so much of this information that they won't be able to see the wood for the trees?
I think there's a misconception about how this data would ever be used. It's not something, people are not sitting there looking at all this and trying to see patterns, and they're not necessarily even analysing that data and trying to see patterns all the time or anything else. What we're looking at is what already exists for emails and phone calls, which is, you know, the connections that are made, and that was legislated for already. There's been a call to extend that, you know, more.
Sorry, just explain what you mean, Justin, when you say the connections that are made.
It's the macros. Again, we're not looking. There are not banks of people sitting looking through emails to see if anyone said anything suspect. That is not how anything like this is being used or working. What we're talking about here is stuff that supports an investigation. It's absolutely intelligence-led anyway. This is the point. But you need the research data, if you like, to actually look at things. It's so you'll be dealing with something, again, that's been intelligence generated. There is a suspect, a group of individuals, you know, that you might know from a human source, you know, are talking about doing something nefarious and, again, threatening. What you want to be able to do is actually understand their network, understand the connections between those people, and at which point you can go to a repository of data that exists and be able to say, right, okay, you know, what else can we pull out of the data? Not, let's go through all this data and see what there is there, and if that helps us. So, you know, it's not that people are going to be sitting there having to sift through this, make sense of it or anything else. It's that ability to say that person is suspect, they are planning something, we know they have 3 accomplices, we don't know who they are. Who are the 3 people he's called the most? And the problem is, you know, you can't start working that out when you've only found that individual. So I think that is the purpose of being able to say, what's he done in the last year?
All right, I'm a little less alarmed by these proposals now that Justin has explained it that way. Let's bring in Nino once again to ask him what he thinks. If a government or an intelligence agency came to a technology company, I don't know, something like Google, Microsoft or Apple, and said, look, there are these people that we're targeting specifically, give us all you've got on them in terms of their communications, would the technology industry be more amenable to that?
I think so, and also people at large wouldn't have a problem with that. So it wouldn't prompt people to look for different software alternatives because they know that it's not open sharing across the board. There's not a backdoor. You can, you know, use it with a reliability, with a sense of privacy.
Okay. Does that technology already exist?
To some extent. So what a lot of companies in Silicon Valley are doing are using some of these technologies that the intelligence agencies also like to use, but they're doing it to make a profit. So Google, for example, if you use Gmail, they automatically read through the emails in Gmail to figure out what kind of advertising to show you.
Okay. So the advice basically from the technology industry, the technology sector, to any government or agency thinking about introducing legislation such as what David Cameron was proposing is to talk to us, get our advice. This is something that's got to be done in conjunction with the technology industry?
I think so. I think that would be useful. And the technology industry is amenable to doing that. From what we've seen, that they've been doing that already in specific cases, providing reams of data, not just showing what the person is doing when they're online, but also showing the device they're using to log in from, their location, if they're using a phone, where they are specifically on a map. Okay.
And there we must leave it for today. Thank you, all of you, Sarah Ogilvie and Justin Crump in London, and Nino Keda here in Doha. And thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can let us know what you think about what you've heard in this programme. In fact, I'd love to know what you think. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Bye for now.